The living room smelled like vanilla frosting and balloons, an odd but pleasant combination. Wrapping paper was strewn across the floor, evidence of an afternoon well spent. Aurora sat cross-legged in the center of it all, twirling a pink ribbon between her fingers while her stuffed unicorn, affectionately named Sparkle, lay beside her. Scarlett leaned against the kitchen counter, watching her daughter with the kind of quiet admiration that made everything else in the world feel small. 5 years had passed in the blink of an eye. How had they gotten here so fast? The party had been perfect in its small, homemade way. A handful of Aurora's preschool friends had gathered in the tiny apartment, giggling over cupcakes and playing a chaotic game of pin the horn on the unicorn. Scarlett had baked the cake herself, box mix, of course, because who had time to bake from scratch? Aurora had insisted on extra sprinkles, so naturally, half of the frosting was covered in tiny, rainbow-colored dots. It was messy and lopsided and absolutely beautiful. Scarlett's best friend, Naomi, had helped orchestrate the entire event, balancing a plate of cookies in one hand and a juice box in the other like some sort of birthday party warrior. When the last of the kids had been picked up, Naomi had given Scarlett a knowing look. "We survived," she had said, clinking her glass of soda against Scarlett's. It was only later that the accident happened. One moment, Aurora had been skipping through the hallway in her socks, a balloon still tied to her wrist, and the next, there was a sharp cry followed by the unmistakable thud of a little body meeting hardwood. Scarlett's heart had leaped into her throat as she rushed forward, her hands trembling as she lifted Aurora into her arms. A small but steady stream of blood trickled from a cut near her eyebrow. The sight of it made Scarlett dizzy. At the hospital, Aurora was surprisingly brave, clutching Sparkle as the nurse dabbed at the wound. Scarlett winced harder than her daughter did. "She'll be just fine," the nurse reassured her, smiling as she prepared the stitches. "Tough kid." The nerves in Scarlett's chest began to unwind. "Tougher than me," she admitted, brushing a few strands of damp hair from Aurora's forehead. "Just a couple of stitches," the nurse added. "No need to worry." She turned to the chart, scanning the information, and then paused. Her brow furrowed slightly, and she glanced between Scarlett and Aurora, as if something wasn't quite computing. Scarlett noticed but didn't think much of it. "Did you want to confirm her blood type for our records?" the nurse asked, her voice careful. Scarlett frowned. "Her blood type? It should be A positive, same as mine." The nurse hesitated, then tapped something on the chart. "Actually, the preliminary check shows she's O negative." Scarlett let out a small laugh. "That can't be right. Her father was B positive. She can't be O negative." The nurse didn't laugh with her. "Blood types don't change," she said gently. Scarlett opened her mouth, then closed it again. The conversation had taken a turn she wasn't prepared for. "Must be a mistake," she said, waving it off, but something uneasy settled in her stomach. "I'm sure it is," the nurse agreed quickly, but there was a note in her voice that suggested she wasn't as convinced. By the time Aurora's stitches were finished, the moment had passed, replaced by hugs and promises of ice cream. The hospital visit became just another minor parenting disaster, the kind that would be funny in hindsight. But the nurse's hesitation lingered in Scarlett's mind, like an itch she couldn't quite scratch. 2 days later, Scarlett got a call from the hospital. She answered on autopilot, balancing a grocery bag on her hip while trying to shove her keys into the front door. "Miss Holloway?" Scarlett frowned. No one ever called her that unless something was wrong. "Yes? This is Dr. Patel from City General. I'm calling about Aurora's routine lab work." Scarlett's grip on the phone tightened. "Is everything okay?" A pause. Then a breath. Then the sentence that would change everything. "There's been an anomaly with the test results. We'd like you to come in for further discussion." Scarlett's stomach dropped. "What kind of anomaly?" Another pause. "I think it's best if we discuss it in person." Scarlett didn't wait. She drove to the hospital with Aurora in the back seat, humming to herself like the world hadn't just tilted on its axis. The waiting room smelled sterile, the overhead lights buzzing faintly as Scarlett tapped her foot against the linoleum floor. When they finally led her into the doctor's office, she barely sat before demanding answers. "What's going on?" Dr. Patel adjusted his glasses and folded his hands on the desk. "Miss Holloway, I don't want to alarm you, but we ran additional tests on Aurora's blood sample. The results are definitive." Scarlett's heart pounded so hard she could barely hear him. "Definitive how?" Dr. Patel exhaled slowly, as if he, too, wished he didn't have to say it. "Aurora isn't biologically related to you." The words settled into the air, heavy and immovable. Scarlett blinked. Then she let out a short laugh, one that didn't sound like her own. "I don't understand." "That's impossible." "I understand this must be a shock." "No," Scarlett shook her head fiercely. "I was pregnant with her. I felt her kick. I gave birth to her. This isn't just some mix-up. She's my daughter." Dr. Patel nodded. "I believe you. But the DNA test doesn't lie." Scarlett felt like she was standing at the edge of a cliff, the ground beneath her crumbling. She stared at him, willing him to take it back, to say there had been another mistake, that someone had mixed up the samples again. But he didn't. He just watched her with quiet sympathy. Her fingers dug into the armrests of the chair. "Then where's my real daughter?" No one had an answer. Scarlett sat in the hospital's administrative office, her nails digging into the cheap plastic of the visitor's chair. The walls were a muted beige, the kind of color designed to be unmemorable, but today, everything felt too sharp, too bright, too clinical. Across the desk, a woman in a crisp blazer and a nameplate that read Karen Ellsworth, patient relations coordinator, folded her hands and smiled with the kind of practiced patience that set Scarlett's teeth on edge. "I understand this must be confusing," Karen said, her voice smooth, her expression carefully neutral. "But lab errors happen more often than people realize. There are a number of reasons why the results might have been inaccurate: sample contamination, technician oversight." Scarlett's grip tightened. "Then run it again." Karen's smile didn't waver. "We certainly can, but I assure you, this is nothing to be alarmed about. Your daughter is happy and healthy, and that's what really matters, right?" Scarlett felt her pulse hammer in her ears. "What matters," she said, keeping her voice steady, "is knowing the truth. You don't get to pat me on the head and send me home like some paranoid mother who read too many conspiracy blogs. Do the test again." Karen opened her mouth, but something in Scarlett's face must have stopped her. She sighed, clicked a few keys on her computer, and nodded. "We'll process a new request." Scarlett exhaled, her hands still trembling as she pushed herself up from the chair. "Good. Call me when you have the results." She walked out without waiting for a reply. That night, she barely slept. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw Aurora as a newborn, bundled in the soft pink blanket the hospital had given her. She remembered the weight of her tiny body against her chest, the way her fingers had curled instinctively around Scarlett's. It had been real. It had been hers. Hadn't it? 2 days later, the hospital called back. The new test results were identical to the first. The next morning, Scarlett sat in the waiting room of a private DNA testing clinic, gripping a clipboard so tightly her knuckles ached. A receptionist in pastel scrubs gave her a sympathetic smile as she handed over the necessary forms. This place smelled less sterile than the hospital, but it still had that faint antiseptic scent that made Scarlett's stomach churn. She had to be sure. She had told Naomi everything, and in true Naomi fashion, she had shown up at Scarlett's apartment with coffee, a notebook, and a plan. "Best case scenario, the hospital's just incompetent," Naomi had said, flipping open her notebook. "Worst case scenario, something actually happened, and we need a lawyer." Scarlett had snorted. Worst case scenario, Aurora isn't mine, and someone else has my real daughter. Naomi had gone quiet at that. Now, sitting in the clinic, Scarlett couldn't shake the feeling that this was the moment everything would shift. If the hospital's test was wrong, she could breathe again. If it wasn't. A nurse called Aurora's name, and Scarlett took her hand, walking her back toward the exam room. Aurora, oblivious, swung their linked hands back and forth. "Mommy, do I get a sticker?" Scarlett forced a smile. "Of course, baby." The test itself was simple. A quick swab inside Aurora's cheek, Scarlett's own sample taken the same way, and then a promise that results would be ready in 3 days. The wait stretched endlessly, every hour thick with the weight of uncertainty. When the call finally came, Scarlett sat on her couch, her hands clutching the phone so tightly she was afraid she might crack the plastic. "The results confirm the previous tests," the technician said, his voice gentle, as if preparing for an emotional collapse on her end. "There is 0 probability of maternity." "I'm so sorry." Scarlett barely mumbled a response before hanging up. Aurora wasn't hers. She didn't remember setting the phone down. She didn't remember moving to the bedroom, curling onto her side, pulling her knees up toward her chest like she could make herself small enough to make this disappear. She must have fallen asleep because she woke to the sound of Aurora's giggles in the next room, Naomi's voice lilting in amusement. Scarlett forced herself up, moving toward the doorway, watching as Naomi sat on the floor with Aurora, stacking colorful blocks into an impressive tower. Naomi glanced up, her expression shifting the moment she saw Scarlett. She reached out, squeezing Scarlett's hand. "We're gonna figure this out," she murmured. Scarlett nodded, but inside, her mind was unraveling. She needed more than a DNA test. She needed answers. The next morning, she drove back to the hospital, requesting copies of her medical records. The receptionist, a young man with round glasses and a nervous smile, hesitated. Usually, these requests take a few days to process. Scarlett didn't blink. "I'll wait." She had come prepared, clutching a printout of patient rights, highlighting every section that legally required them to comply. The receptionist left and returned 10 minutes later, handing her a sealed envelope. Scarlett sat in her car, heart hammering, as she ripped it open. Pages of text, lines of numbers, notes in neat, printed letters. She skimmed through, her eyes scanning until labor end time, 3:27 a.m. Birth recorded, 4:15 a.m. Scarlett frowned, flipping through the pages, searching for an explanation. Nearly an hour unaccounted for. She had labored for over 16 hours, she remembered the exhaustion, the relief when she heard Aurora cry, but she didn't remember a delay. She tried to reason it away. Maybe there was a simple explanation. Maybe she had passed out, something no one thought to mention. Maybe paperwork got misplaced. But nothing about this felt like a simple mistake. She gripped the papers so tightly they crumpled in her hands. Aurora wasn't hers. And if that was true, then someone else had given birth at the same time. Scarlett's stomach twisted. If Aurora wasn't hers, then where was her real daughter? Dr. Adrian Carter had the kind of voice that could make anything sound like a minor inconvenience. A billing error, a scheduling mix-up, a child being handed to the wrong mother in a hospital, apparently, to him, all just clerical issues. Scarlett sat across from him in his immaculate office, watching as he adjusted his tie in the reflection of his computer screen. He barely looked at her, which was impressive considering she was practically vibrating with rage. "There's no cause for concern," he said smoothly, clicking through files on his desktop. "These things happen more often than you think. It's almost always an error in record keeping. Data entry mistakes. Typos." He said typos, like Aurora's entire existence, could be reduced to a misclicked button. Scarlett clenched her fists under the desk. "My child isn't a typo." Dr. Carter sighed, finally, looking at her. His expression was calm, patronizingly so. "Miss Holloway, I understand how upsetting this must be, but what I'm telling you is that there is no evidence that anything happened that night outside of the ordinary. Your daughter is your daughter. The birth certificate, the hospital records, everything is clear. Except for the DNA test," she snapped. "A test that could have been mislabeled," he countered without missing a beat. "Twice?" He folded his hands, exhaling through his nose. "Miss Holloway, what is it that you want?" "I want to know what happened the night my daughter was born." Dr. Carter leaned back, his chair creaking. "The same thing that happens every night. A series of exhausted women gave birth, a rotation of nurses did their jobs, and a handful of newborns were brought into the world. You're asking me to dig into something that happened years ago, when there is no proof that anything is actually wrong." Scarlett's nails dug into her palms. "There's proof." He held up a hand. "A blood test isn't proof of a crime. It's a medical anomaly." Anomaly. That was the word he was going with. Not mistake, not negligence, just a casual, quirky little anomaly, like a car engine making a funny noise or a vending machine refusing to take a dollar bill. Scarlett's body felt electric with frustration. She wanted to stand up, flip his desk, scream in his face. Instead, she forced herself to take a deep breath. "Then you won't mind if I request access to all medical records from that night?" Dr. Carter's easy demeanor tightened just slightly. "That's not possible." "Why not?" "Because those records contain private information about other patients. I only need mine." He smiled like she had misunderstood something very simple. "Miss Holloway, birth logs include multiple patients. We can't just go handing them out." "Then let me see my own file." "I assure you, everything in your file is accurate." Scarlett's jaw tensed. He was stonewalling her. And he was doing it so confidently, so dismissively, that it made her feel like maybe she was the one being unreasonable. Dr. Carter checked his watch, a deliberate movement. "I understand this is difficult, but you need to think about what's best for your child. Is digging into this really going to help her? Or will it just cause unnecessary confusion?" Scarlett stood abruptly. "You know what would be best for my child? Knowing if she's actually mine." Dr. Carter exhaled sharply, rubbing his forehead. "Miss Holloway. Thank you for your time," she cut in before he could finish whatever useless sentence he was about to deliver. She grabbed her bag, turned on her heel, and stormed out of the office. She didn't even make it to the car before she started crying. The drive home was a blur of honking horns and streetlights that all looked too bright. She pulled into her parking spot, wiped her face, and sat gripping the steering wheel until the anger dulled into something quieter, something more dangerous. Dr. Carter thought she would drop it. He thought he could dismiss her like she was just another overdramatic mother who had Googled too much and convinced herself of something ridiculous. She was not dropping this. Scarlett wasn't an idiot. She had worked in an office long enough to know that when someone was that eager to shut down questions, it meant there was something to hide. And if Dr. Carter wasn't going to help her, she was going to find someone who would. She took a deep breath and grabbed her phone. The hospital had been so sure she wouldn't push. But there was one person they hadn't accounted for. Scarlett scrolled through the list of employees, skimming names until one jumped out at her. Naomi Tran. A nurse. One who had been working at the hospital for over a decade. Scarlett tapped on her profile, found her contact information, and took another deep breath before pressing call. The phone rang 4 times before a voice answered, cautious and a little tired. "Hello? Naomi?" A pause. "Who's this?" Scarlett's throat tightened. "You don't know me. But I think you might have been working the night my daughter was born." The silence on the other end was deafening. Scarlett closed her eyes, pressing her fingers to her temple. "Please. I just need to ask you some questions. A long exhale. Then, quietly, I can't talk about this over the phone. Scarlett's pulse quickened. Then can we meet? Naomi hesitated. I don't know. Please, Scarlett whispered, voice barely holding together. Something happened that night. I just need to know the truth. Another beat of silence. Then, finally, a reluctant sigh. Tomorrow. After my shift. There's a coffee shop on 8th and Vernon. Don't be late. The line went dead. Scarlett let the phone drop into her lap. Her hands were shaking. This was it. Someone knew something. And she was about to find out what. The coffee shop was half empty, the kind of place where the pastries looked better than they tasted and the espresso machine wheezed like an asthmatic. Scarlett sat at a small table by the window, gripping her cup so tightly her knuckles turned white. Across from her, Naomi Tran stirred her tea, though she hadn't taken a sip. She looked exhausted. Her scrubs were wrinkled, her dark hair pulled into a bun that had started to come undone. Every few seconds, she glanced over her shoulder, as if she expected someone to swoop in and drag her away. I shouldn't be talking to you, Naomi muttered. Scarlett leaned in. I just want the truth. Naomi let out a slow breath, setting her spoon down. You don't understand how dangerous this is. Scarlett's stomach twisted. Dangerous? Not in the way you're thinking. Naomi rubbed her forehead. I mean for you. If you go down this path, if you open this door, you won't be able to close it. I don't care, Scarlett said. Aurora isn't my daughter. And if she isn't mine, I need to know who she is. Naomi was silent for a long time, staring at the table. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. There was a power outage that night. Scarlett blinked. Naomi let out a short, humorless laugh. You have no idea how chaotic a blackout is in a hospital. Even with backup generators, there's a window of time where everything is. She shook her head. Just a mess. And it happened while you were in labor. Scarlett's pulse pounded in her ears. What are you saying? Naomi took another deep breath, like she was about to confess something she had been carrying for years. There were 2 emergency births that night, she said. Yours and another woman's. Scarlett felt the world tilt. Aubrey Reynolds. The name meant nothing to her. A stranger. Someone who had given birth just as she had, while the hospital lights flickered, while nurses and doctors scrambled in the dim glow of emergency lamps. Naomi's fingers tightened around her cup. After the power came back on, there was confusion in the NICU. Scarlett's hands went numb. I wasn't working that unit, but I heard whispers. There were 2 babies. And after the blackout, there was uncertainty about which baby belonged to which mother. Scarlett's breath hitched. Staff swore everything was sorted out, Naomi continued. Paperwork was adjusted. But mistakes happen, especially when people are panicking. She swallowed hard. I think your babies were switched. Scarlett barely registered the clatter of her coffee cup as she set it down too hard. Her entire body felt like it had been plunged into ice water. My baby, she whispered. My real baby. She pressed a hand against her forehead, nausea creeping in. Everything she knew, everything she had built her life around, was unraveling in front of her. Naomi's expression was pained. I thought about speaking up back then, but I had no proof. And no one wanted to hear it. Do you know what it's like to accuse a hospital of something like that? Scarlett barely heard her. She was already reaching for her phone, her mind moving at 100 miles an hour. Aubrey Reynolds. She had a name. She needed a face. She opened social media, fingers trembling as she typed. There were a few profiles. A couple of private accounts. Then. Her breath caught. The woman in the profile picture was holding a little girl. Scarlett clicked on the image, her heart slamming against her ribs. The child was about 5 years old, with a toothy grin and curls that looked impossible to tame. And she had Scarlett's eyes. Not just similar. Not just vaguely familiar. The exact same shape, the exact same shade of green Scarlett had stared at in the mirror her entire life. Scarlett zoomed in, scanning the girl's face like she was trying to memorize every detail. Then she saw it. A tiny birthmark on the girl's left shoulder. The same birthmark Scarlett had. The same one her mother had. Her stomach turned over. Violet. That was her name. Scarlett's vision blurred. Violet was her real daughter. She swallowed back the rising nausea, blinking rapidly. Her real daughter was out there. And she had no idea. Scarlett dropped the phone onto the table, pushing back from her chair as panic clawed its way up her throat. Naomi reached for her wrist. Hey. Breathe. Scarlett's chest felt too tight. I have to. Naomi squeezed gently. I know. But you have to think before you act. You can't just show up at her door and tell her she's been raising the wrong child. Scarlett's heart thundered in her chest. Then what am I supposed to do? Naomi hesitated. You have to be smart about this. Scarlett pressed her palms against her face, trying to think through the static in her head. She couldn't just sit with this information. She couldn't go home and pretend everything was fine. She had to talk to Aubrey. She had to find a way to tell her. But how did you tell a mother that the daughter she had loved and raised wasn't hers? Scarlett never thought she'd be the kind of person to orchestrate a fake social event just to meet a stranger, but here she was, standing in the middle of a neighborhood park with a clipboard and a stack of flyers, pretending she was organizing a community picnic. She had spent an embarrassing amount of time debating what kind of event would feel natural enough that she could invite a complete stranger without raising suspicion. A park gathering seemed safe. Casual. Non-threatening. She had found Aubrey's address with some careful internet sleuthing, cross-referencing an old work profile with a local business listing. It had taken 3 cups of coffee and the kind of obsessive determination usually reserved for last-minute science fair projects. Once she had the address, she had done something she still wasn't sure she could justify. She had driven past the house. Just once. Just to see. It was small but well kept, a little white bungalow with blue shutters and a swing set in the yard. There had been a flower box under the window, slightly overgrown, and 2 pink scooters abandoned near the driveway. Scarlett had gripped the steering wheel so hard her fingers ached. Somewhere inside that house was her daughter. The daughter she hadn't held since birth. Now, standing near the park's picnic tables, she scanned the crowd, heart pounding as if she were waiting for an exam she hadn't studied for. Parents milled around, chatting while their kids chased bubbles and threw frisbees. Scarlett had extended the invite to most of the families in the area, hoping to make it feel natural. She didn't want Aubrey to feel targeted, even though this entire event existed for one reason and one reason only. Then, there she was. Aubrey Reynolds. Scarlett felt like she had stepped into some surreal version of her own life, where things were slightly off-kilter but no one else noticed. Aubrey looked about the same age as her, maybe a little younger, with wavy brown hair pulled into a ponytail and a sundress that had probably seen better days. She carried herself like someone who was constantly balancing too many things at once, adjusting a tote bag over her shoulder while reaching down to pick up a stuffed animal that had been dropped on the sidewalk. And beside her, gripping the hem of her dress, was Violet. Scarlett's lungs forgot how to function. It was like looking into a childhood mirror. The same green eyes, wide and bright. The same dark curls that refused to be tamed. The same little birthmark on her left shoulder, peeking out from under her ruffled sleeve. Scarlett felt dizzy. This was her child. Her real, actual child, standing 5 feet away from her, completely unaware. Scarlett swallowed hard, forcing herself to focus as Aubrey glanced around, looking slightly unsure. "Hi," Scarlett said, stepping forward with what she hoped was a casual smile. "I'm Scarlett. I think we messaged about the picnic." Aubrey shifted Violet onto her hip and nodded. "Oh, right. Sorry we're late. It took me longer than I expected to get out the door." She looked down at Violet and gave her a quick squeeze. Somebody couldn't decide which dress to wear. Scarlett tried to laugh, but it came out wrong, like she had forgotten how sound was supposed to work. She nodded instead. Violet squirmed in her mother's arms, reaching toward the ground. Aubrey set her down, and she immediately took off toward the playground. Scarlett's eyes followed her, unable to look away. "She's adorable," Scarlett said, her voice uneven. Aubrey smiled. "She's a handful." Scarlett forced herself to stop staring. She gestured toward the snack table. "There's lemonade, if you want some. And I think someone brought cookies." Aubrey nodded, shifting her bag on her shoulder. "Thanks." Scarlett watched as she walked away, then exhaled sharply, pressing a hand to her chest. She needed to get herself together. She had spent so much time wondering what it would be like to see Violet, and now that she was here, Scarlett felt completely unprepared. Her heart was a tangled mess of emotions she hadn't fully processed. She loved Aurora more than anything. That was undeniable. Aurora was her daughter in every way that mattered. But Violet was her blood. Her genes. Her history. She had missed everything. Her first steps. Her first words. The way she crinkled her nose when she laughed. Scarlett felt a sharp pang of guilt, because no matter how much she told herself that she had done nothing wrong, that she had been a victim in all of this, she couldn't shake the feeling that she had failed. She had been raising someone else's child while another woman had been raising hers. She looked back toward the playground, where Violet was climbing onto a swing. Scarlett had no idea how she was supposed to do this. She couldn't just walk up to Aubrey and drop this bomb on her in the middle of a picnic. There was no script for this kind of thing. No way to gently tell a mother that the child she had loved and nurtured for 5 years wasn't hers. Scarlett clenched her hands into fists, willing herself to stay calm. She needed to do this the right way. If such a thing even existed. Aubrey laughed as she watched Violet sprint across the playground, her curls bouncing with each step. "She's going to wear herself out before we even get home," she said, shaking her head. "Not that I'm complaining. I could use an easy bedtime tonight." Scarlett smiled, though her mind was still racing. Being near Violet was surreal in a way she hadn't expected. Every small movement, every expression, it all felt achingly familiar, like watching an old home video of herself as a child. Aubrey reached into her bag and pulled out a water bottle. She twisted off the cap, took a sip, and sighed. "It's so nice to be out of the house," she said. "Honestly, I've been feeling off lately. Just run down, I guess." Scarlett's stomach tensed. "Run down how?" Aubrey waved a dismissive hand. "You know, the usual mom stuff. Tired all the time, dizzy sometimes. I probably just need more sleep." Scarlett frowned. "That doesn't sound like just being tired." "It's nothing," Aubrey said. "I don't have time to be sick." Scarlett crossed her arms. "That's not how it works." Aubrey sighed and took another sip of water. "I'm fine. Have you seen a doctor?" Aubrey gave her a look. Scarlett tilted her head. "What? You think I have time to sit around in waiting rooms for someone to tell me I need to eat more leafy greens?" Scarlett let out a breath. "I think it could be something more serious." Aubrey's face softened. "I appreciate the concern, I do. But I can't afford to take off work for a bunch of expensive tests. It's not that simple." Scarlett wanted to argue. She wanted to insist, to grab her by the shoulders and shake some sense into her, but before she could say anything else, Violet came running over, her face flushed from the sun. "Mommy, I'm thirsty," she announced. Aubrey handed her the bottle. "Drink slow, sweetheart. You always chug it too fast." Scarlett watched them, her chest tightening. Violet had no idea that anything was wrong. No idea that her mother was brushing off something that might be serious. Scarlett swallowed her unease and forced herself to smile. "She's got a lot of energy." Aubrey snorted. "You have no idea." Scarlett wanted to push the subject, but she could tell it wasn't going anywhere. Aubrey had made up her mind. And there was only so much she could do without crossing a line. She had to let it go. For now. Later that evening, Scarlett couldn't stop thinking about it. She told herself she was overreacting, that people felt run down all the time and it wasn't a sign of something catastrophic. But there was a nagging feeling in the back of her mind, something she couldn't quite shake. She was still thinking about it the next day, sitting at her kitchen table with a cup of coffee she had already reheated twice. And then her phone rang. The number was unfamiliar. She hesitated before answering. "Scarlett?" She sat up straighter. "Aubrey?" There was a pause. Then another voice came on the line. A man's voice. "Hi, ma'am. This is James from Briarwood Urgent Care. I'm calling because we have a patient here, Aubrey Reynolds. She collapsed earlier today, and you were listed as her emergency contact." Scarlett's blood ran cold. What? "She was brought in about an hour ago," the man continued. "She's stable, but the doctors are running some tests." Scarlett was already grabbing her keys. "I'll be there in 10 minutes. The waiting room smelled like antiseptic and old magazines. Scarlett sat in one of the plastic chairs, her knee bouncing. She had barely spoken to the receptionist before rushing through the doors, demanding to see Aubrey. Now she was stuck waiting. The minutes dragged. Finally, a nurse appeared. "Scarlett Holloway?" She shot to her feet. "Yes. She's awake. You can see her now." Scarlett followed the nurse down the hall, her heart pounding. Aubrey was sitting up in bed, looking paler than Scarlett had ever seen her. She gave a tired smile. "I bet you're going to say, 'I told you so.'" Scarlett let out a shaky breath. "What happened?" Aubrey sighed, rubbing her forehead. "I was at work, and I guess I got dizzy. Next thing I know, I'm on the floor, and someone's calling an ambulance." Scarlett's chest ached. "Aubrey." "I'm fine," Aubrey said quickly. "They're running tests, but—" "You are not fine," Scarlett snapped. Aubrey held up a hand. "Okay." Poor choice of words. Scarlett sat down in the chair next to the bed, pressing her palms against her eyes. "I knew something was wrong." Aubrey exhaled. "They think it's something with my blood pressure. Maybe anemia. I don't know yet." Scarlett's fingers curled around the armrest. If something happened to Aubrey, who would take care of Violet? Scarlett lifted her head, studying Aubrey's face. She was going to say it. She had to. "Aubrey." Aubrey glanced at her, eyebrows raised. Scarlett's throat felt tight. "There's something I have to tell you." Aubrey's expression shifted. "What is it?" Scarlett took a breath. Her voice faltered. Aubrey frowned. "Scarlett, you're freaking me out." Scarlett clenched her hands together. "I found something out recently. Something big." Aubrey waited. Scarlett's stomach turned. How do you tell someone that their daughter isn't really theirs? She exhaled slowly. "Aubrey, the night we gave birth, there was a mistake. Aubrey's face froze. Scarlett swallowed. We had our babies the same night. During the blackout. Aubrey blinked. What are you talking about? Scarlett forced herself to meet her eyes. I think they switched our daughters. The silence was suffocating. Aubrey let out a short laugh, but it was humorless. Scarlett, that's crazy. Scarlett pulled out her phone, scrolling until she found the picture. The one of Violet. She held it up. Aubrey stared. Scarlett's voice was barely a whisper. That's my daughter. Aubrey didn't move. Scarlett placed the phone on the bed. Aubrey's hand trembled as she picked it up. She stared at it. Then at Scarlett. Then back at the photo. Scarlett swallowed the lump in her throat. Aurora is yours. And Violet is mine. Aubrey didn't speak. Scarlett held her breath. Then, finally. Aubrey whispered, "Oh my God." Aubrey's fingers trembled as she gripped the phone, her eyes locked on the picture. She wasn't blinking. She wasn't speaking. She was just staring, her face frozen in an expression Scarlett couldn't quite decipher. It was like watching someone unravel in slow motion. Scarlett held her breath, waiting for it to sink in. Aubrey finally let out a soft, uneven breath. No, she whispered. Scarlett's chest tightened. Aubrey shook her head, more forcefully this time. No, no, no. This is insane. Scarlett didn't argue. She had gone through this exact process herself, the disbelief, the gut-wrenching refusal to accept it, the way every piece of logic in her brain had screamed that it was impossible. But the facts didn't care what she wanted to believe. Aubrey was breathing faster now, her knuckles white around the phone. You're wrong. There's no way. Scarlett pressed her lips together. I'm not wrong. Aubrey looked up at her, and for a second, Scarlett thought she was going to throw the phone across the hospital room. But instead, her shoulders sagged, and her whole body seemed to deflate. She exhaled shakily. Oh my God. Scarlett felt something splinter inside her. Aubrey swallowed hard, dragging her gaze back to the picture, her fingers hesitantly tracing the screen. She has your eyes. Scarlett barely nodded. She had spent so long staring at that photo, memorizing every small detail, searching for proof of something her heart already knew. Aubrey's voice was barely a whisper. This explains everything. Scarlett forced herself to speak. What do you mean? Aubrey let out a short, humorless laugh. I love her. You have to know that. Scarlett nodded, because of course she did. But there were moments, Aubrey's voice cracked. Tiny, fleeting moments where something felt off. Where I'd see her do something and think, that doesn't come from me. And I hated myself for it. Her hands trembled. I told myself I was being crazy. I convinced myself that biology didn't matter, that sometimes kids just take after distant relatives. But deep down, her breath hitched. I always felt it. Scarlett's chest tightened. Aubrey looked up at her, eyes glassy. I've been raising your daughter. Scarlett let out a slow, shaky breath. And I've been raising yours. Aubrey blinked rapidly, like she was trying to force the tears back. She failed. Her shoulders shook as she covered her face with her hands. Scarlett didn't hesitate. She reached for her, pulling her into a tight embrace, and that was all it took. Aubrey sobbed into her shoulder, gripping Scarlett like she was the only thing keeping her from collapsing completely. Scarlett felt herself shaking too, the weight of everything crashing down at once. They clung to each other, two mothers mourning the lives they had missed, the moments that had been stolen from them, the babies they had never had the chance to hold beyond that first night in the hospital. When Aubrey finally pulled away, she wiped at her damp cheeks. What do we do? Scarlett sniffed, willing herself to stay steady. We don't separate them. Aubrey's expression softened. They're sisters, Scarlett whispered. They've grown up together. We can't take that away from them. Aubrey nodded slowly. You're right. Scarlett exhaled. We find a way to make this work. Aubrey gave a watery laugh. This wasn't exactly in my parenting handbook. Scarlett let out a soft chuckle, though there was no humor behind it. Same. Aubrey's eyes darkened. But the hospital. Scarlett's jaw tightened. They did this. Aubrey's hands curled into fists. They let this happen. Scarlett grabbed her phone. We make them pay for it. Aubrey's voice was firm. Then let's do it. Scarlett scrolled through her contacts, her pulse steady now. I know someone. A lawyer. She's good. Aubrey straightened, her expression resolute. Let's get justice. Scarlett had never been inside a law office before, and if she were being honest, she had always imagined them to be a little more dramatic. Movies made it seem like lawyers worked in towering buildings made of nothing but glass and ambition, where they spent their days shouting, "Objection," and making game-changing speeches at the 11th hour. In reality, Claire Martin's office was smaller than Scarlett's living room, smelled faintly of burnt coffee, and had a cluttered desk that suggested its owner had about 5 minutes of free time per week. Claire, a no-nonsense woman in her 40s with sharp eyes and a sharper tongue, barely looked up as she flipped through the folder in front of her. You two are about to make a lot of people very uncomfortable, she said, scanning the documents with an almost lazy confidence. That's my favorite kind of case. Aubrey, who had been quiet since they arrived, crossed her arms. The hospital already denied everything. What if they keep stalling? Claire smirked. They won't. Scarlett leaned forward. How do you know? Claire turned a page, eyes skimming quickly. Because they were sloppy. She slid a paper across the desk. We found an incident report from the night of the blackout. Scarlett grabbed it, her pulse spiking. Aubrey shifted beside her, leaning in to read. The words were cold. Clinical. A nurse, identified only by an employee number, had filed a concern about confusion in the NICU during the power outage. The notes mentioned that 2 newborns had temporarily been placed in the wrong bassinets but were properly reassigned following verification. Aubrey's breath hitched. Properly reassigned? Scarlett's hands clenched around the edges of the paper. They knew. Claire nodded. And they buried it. Aubrey exhaled sharply. So what do we do now? Claire sat back in her chair, tapping a pen against the desk. Now? We let them know we have it. The hospital's lawyers didn't take long to respond after that. Less than 24 hours later, Claire's office received a call requesting an urgent meeting. Scarlett and Aubrey sat across from her desk, their stomachs in knots as she listened, nodding occasionally before hanging up with a smirk. Well, Claire said, setting her phone down. They're scared. Aubrey scoffed. Good. Scarlett's hands felt clammy. What did they say? Claire folded her arms. They want to settle. Silence stretched between them. Aubrey blinked. Just like that? They don't want this in court. Claire leaned forward. They know what happens if this goes public. A jury would tear them apart. Scarlett let out a slow breath. The hospital had spent weeks ignoring them, dismissing them, treating them like a nuisance. And now, with one document, the tide had shifted. Aubrey sat up straighter. So what's the offer? Claire's lips curled. Let's find out. Scarlett had always imagined that winning something, anything, would feel triumphant. That there would be some kind of moment where the sky opened up, where the universe gave her a nod of approval, where she could throw her arms up in victory and scream, I did it. But sitting across from the hospital's attorneys in an overly air-conditioned conference room, she mostly just felt exhausted. Aubrey sat beside her, stiff-backed, arms crossed so tightly it looked like she might snap in half. Across the table, 3 lawyers in expensive suits shuffled papers, speaking in hushed tones to one another like they could still negotiate their way out of this. Dr. Carter was there, too, perched at the head of the table like a man who had barely survived a car crash and was still trying to convince himself he wasn't injured. Scarlett hadn't spoken to him since their last meeting, but now, with Claire Martin leading the charge, she didn't have to. Claire tapped a pen against her folder. "Let's be clear about something," she said, voice sharp enough to cut through glass. "A simple financial settlement is not going to cut it." One of the lawyers, a man with salt and pepper hair and the kind of polished demeanor that suggested he had been paid to make problems disappear for a very long time, cleared his throat. "We are prepared to offer a substantial sum." Aubrey let out a short, humorless laugh. "Of course you are." Scarlett leaned forward. "Do you think you can just write a check and make this go away?" Another lawyer, a younger woman who looked deeply uncomfortable, shifted in her chair. "We recognize the gravity of the situation, Miss Holloway." "But..." "No," Claire interrupted. "You don't." She slid the incident report across the table. "Or else you wouldn't have buried this." Dr. Carter cleared his throat, shifting uncomfortably. "There was no..." "Don't," Aubrey cut in. "Just don't." Scarlett could feel her heart pounding in her chest. She had spent weeks clawing her way toward this moment, had replayed every version of this conversation in her head. She had imagined them groveling. She had imagined them indifferent. She had imagined them angry. She had not imagined the quiet, suffocating panic that now filled the room. Claire folded her hands. "We're not here to negotiate a number. We're here to demand security for our clients and their daughters." The younger lawyer adjusted her glasses. "What kind of security?" Scarlett took a breath. "Aubrey's medical care. Full coverage. No loopholes. No cutting her off after a year." Aubrey lifted her chin. "And trust funds for both girls. Enough to make up for what was stolen from them." The older lawyer exchanged glances with his colleagues. "That's a significant request." Claire's smile was razor sharp. "So was stealing their children." Silence. The younger lawyer jotted something down. "And what else?" Scarlett exhaled. "A public acknowledgement." Dr. Carter straightened. "Absolutely not." Claire arched a brow. "Then we go to trial." Scarlett didn't miss the way his fingers twitched. The way his shoulders tensed. He knew. He knew they'd win. The room was so quiet Scarlett could hear the faint hum of the air vents. Finally, the older lawyer sighed, adjusting his tie like it was suddenly too tight. "We'll need time to draft the terms." Claire leaned back. "Take your time." Scarlett's hand found Aubrey's beneath the table, squeezing once. They had one. Aubrey had never been good at slowing down. Slowing down meant acknowledging things, exhaustion, stress, the fact that she had been running on fumes for years. Slowing down meant letting someone else take over, and that wasn't something she had ever been comfortable with. But lying in a hospital bed with Scarlett sitting beside her, flipping absent-mindedly through a magazine, Aubrey realized she didn't have a choice. "Did you know this guy has been voted sexiest man alive twice?" Scarlett mused, holding up a glossy page with a chiseled actor staring smugly into the camera. "Twice. That's excessive." Aubrey shot her a weak glare. "Are you seriously talking to me about celebrity gossip right now?" Scarlett shrugged, tossing the magazine onto the bedside table. "I could talk to you about your cholesterol instead, but I figured this was safer." Aubrey groaned, sinking further into the pillow. "God, I miss when you were just some woman from a coffee shop." Scarlett smirked. Yeah, well. That ship has sailed. The nurse entered then, checking Aubrey's and making notes on the chart at the foot of the bed. Scarlett watched her like she was memorizing every detail, sitting up a little straighter, her hands folded neatly in her lap. Aubrey resisted the urge to roll her eyes. Scarlett had appointed herself as her personal watchdog, which was both irritating and, if she was being honest, kind of nice. Everything looks good, the nurse said, adjusting the monitor. Try to get some rest. When the door closed behind her, Aubrey sighed. Rest. Right. I'll get right on that. Scarlett arched a brow. You should. You have a team of doctors looking after you now. Might as well let them do their jobs. Aubrey frowned. Still weird to think about. Scarlett's expression softened. You mean letting someone take care of you? Aubrey scoffed. I don't know how to do that. Scarlett leaned back in her chair, crossing her arms. You don't have to know how. You just let me do it. Aubrey looked at her, eyes narrowing slightly. Why are you like this? Scarlett grinned. Annoying? Relentless. Scarlett smirked. I don't know. Maybe because someone had to be. Aubrey didn't respond to that. The last few weeks had been a blur of doctors' visits, legal meetings, and long, exhausting conversations about what came next. The hospital had agreed to cover every medical expense as part of the settlement, and Claire had made sure there were no loopholes, no buried clauses that could come back to bite them later. Aubrey didn't have to fight anymore. She just had to get better. Scarlett had been at every appointment, showing up with coffee, asking the doctors the questions Aubrey didn't even think to ask. She was there when the medications made her nauseous, when the test results came back with numbers neither of them could fully understand. She sat through waiting rooms and paperwork and insurance calls, and she never once made Aubrey feel like she had to apologize for any of it. Aubrey wasn't used to that. But she was starting to think she could be. Outside the hospital, life continued in a way that felt surreal. Violet and Aurora had adjusted in their own way, slipping into their new reality without the weight that their mothers carried. They didn't see their story as a tragedy or a lawsuit or a hospital scandal. They saw it as something much simpler. They were sisters. Scarlett and Aubrey had made a decision early on not to frame it as losing one daughter and gaining another. There was no talk of switching back, no conversation about what was supposed to happen. It was never about undoing the past. It was about moving forward. Aurora still called Scarlett Mommy, and Violet still called Aubrey Mommy, and that wasn't going to change. But now, Aurora had an extra bedtime story from Aubrey, and Violet had another set of arms to wrap around her when she woke up from a bad dream. It wasn't perfect. There were difficult moments, confusing questions, things that neither Scarlett nor Aubrey had answers for. But it was working. And somehow, without either of them fully acknowledging it, Scarlett and Aubrey had fallen into an arrangement that neither of them had planned. They had become a team. Scarlett had given Aubrey a key to her apartment. Aubrey had done the same. Weekends were flexible. Dinners were joint affairs more often than not. There was no formal custody agreement, no set schedule, no lines drawn in the sand. It didn't matter whose house they were sleeping in. Both bedrooms had stuffed animals and favorite blankets, clothes in both closets, toothbrushes in both bathrooms. The girls had two homes, two mothers, and no expectations beyond the fact that they were loved. Scarlett had gone from a single mother to a mother with a partner, not in the traditional sense, not in the way people expected. But in every way that mattered, she wasn't doing this alone anymore. Aubrey felt the same way. She was still adjusting, still trying to shake the feeling that if she let herself lean too much on Scarlett, it would all collapse. But it hadn't. And the longer she let herself believe it was real, the easier it got. One evening, weeks after Aubrey had been discharged, she stood at Scarlett's kitchen counter, slicing fruit while the girls played in the living room. The sound of laughter filled the space, the kind that made everything feel lighter. Scarlett walked in, glancing at the scene before her. I don't think they ever stop talking. Aubrey smirked. Pretty sure they talk in their sleep. Scarlett reached for a glass, filling it with water. How are you feeling? Aubrey considered lying. Saying she was fine, brushing it off like she always did. But instead, she set down the knife and leaned against the counter. Tired, she admitted. But better. Scarlett nodded, taking a sip of water. Good. Aubrey glanced toward the living room, where Violet and Aurora were deep in conversation about something neither of them fully understood but both felt passionately about. Aubrey exhaled. We're really doing this, aren't we? Scarlett turned to her, a small smile tugging at the corner of her lips. Yeah, she said. We are. Scarlett never imagined she'd know so much about grief. Not the loud, dramatic kind people talked about in movies, the kind with screaming and falling to the ground, with casseroles from well-meaning neighbors and people constantly asking if you were okay. No, this was different. This was quiet. This was waking up in the morning and rolling over to grab her phone, only to realize there were no more updates from Aubrey. This was hearing a joke and making a mental note to tell her, only to remember she couldn't. Aubrey had always made dying seem like something that would happen someday, not soon, not now, not in a way that required planning. She had fought her illness with the kind of stubbornness that made Scarlett want to strangle her on more than one occasion. Even in the final weeks, Aubrey had brushed off concern, cracking jokes in hospital beds, rolling her eyes when Scarlett hovered too much. But Scarlett had known. And so had Aubrey. That last night had been calm. Peaceful, in a way Scarlett wasn't sure she had expected. She had sat beside Aubrey's bed, their hands resting near each other, neither of them saying much. They had talked about the girls, about how Violet had learned to tie her shoes, about how Aurora was insisting on becoming a professional astronaut-ballerina hybrid. She's going to be impossible when she's a teenager, Aubrey had murmured, eyes heavy-lidded but still filled with warmth. Scarlett had smiled. I'm counting on it. Aubrey had been quiet for a long time after that. Then, barely above a whisper, she had said, take care of her. It hadn't been a question. Scarlett had squeezed her hand. Always. And then, Aubrey had closed her eyes. She was gone by morning. The days that followed were a blur. Scarlett handled the arrangements, signed the papers, made the calls. She had never planned a funeral before. She wasn't sure how it was supposed to feel. But in the end, it had been simple, just a handful of close friends, a scattering of flowers, no grand speeches. Just love, and grief, and the feeling of something slipping through her fingers before she was ready. She didn't cry in front of the girls. Not because she thought she had to be strong, but because grief was too big to explain to children who still thought everything in the world made sense. Violet didn't cry either. Not in the way Scarlett expected. Instead, she became quieter. Less open. She curled into herself in a way that made Scarlett's heart ache. She clung to routines like they were the only thing keeping her afloat. Pajamas had to be folded just the way her mother used to do it. Bedtime stories had to be read in the exact same order. Scarlett let her. Aurora, in contrast, filled the house with noise. She followed Violet everywhere, reaching for her hand at the dinner table, offering her favorite toys without a word. She talked constantly, about school, about the weather, about nonsense things that didn't matter. Scarlett recognized it for what it was. Aurora was trying to make the silence go away. One night, Scarlett found Violet curled up on the couch, hugging one of Aubrey's sweaters. Scarlett sat beside her, hesitant, unsure if Violet wanted space or closeness. After a long silence, Violet whispered, I don't want her to be gone. Scarlett swallowed past the lump in her throat. I know. Violet's small hands clenched the fabric tighter. Will I forget her? Scarlett felt her heart break, just a little. No, she said softly. You'll always remember her. And I'll help you. Violet finally turned her head, looking up at Scarlett with big, uncertain eyes. Do you miss her? Scarlett exhaled. Every day. Violet pressed her face into the sweater. Then, so quietly Scarlett almost didn't hear it, she whispered, Me too. The adoption process had already been in motion before Aubrey's passing. She had made sure everything was in place, that Scarlett wouldn't have to fight for Violet. When the final paperwork came through, Scarlett had taken Violet to the courthouse herself. The judge had asked her a few questions, whether she understood what this meant, whether she was ready for the responsibility. Scarlett's voice had been steady. Yes. And just like that, Violet was hers. Not because she hadn't been before, but because now, no one could take her away. At first, the adjustment had been slow. There were good days, bad days, and days that stretched endlessly in between. Some nights, Violet woke up crying and refused to say why. Some mornings, Aurora tried too hard to fix things that couldn't be fixed. Scarlett let them take their time. And slowly, things shifted. The house became a home again, laughter creeping back into corners where grief had settled. Violet and Aurora fell into an easy rhythm, their bond solidified not by shared DNA but by something stronger, by whispered secrets at bedtime, by trading half-eaten cookies, by holding each other's hands without thinking. Scarlett watched them, marveling at the way they just knew. They weren't two girls who had been switched at birth. They were sisters. One evening, months later, Scarlett tucked them into bed, smoothing the blankets over their small bodies. Violet hesitated, then looked up at her. Mom? Scarlett's breath caught. She had never asked Violet to call her that. Never pushed, never expected. She had always assumed it would take time, if it happened at all. Scarlett's throat tightened as she nodded. Yeah, sweetheart. Violet hesitated, then whispered, Good night. Scarlett felt her heart clench. She leaned down, pressing a kiss to her forehead. You were both always mine. Aurora let out a sleepy sigh, already drifting off. Violet curled deeper under the blanket, her small fingers clinging to Scarlett's sleeve for just a moment before letting go. Scarlett turned off the light, leaving the door cracked just enough to let the soft glow of the hallway spill in. She didn't cry until she was alone in the living room, pressing the heels of her hands against her eyes, willing herself to breathe. Not because she was sad, but because she had never loved anything so much in her entire life. Aubrey wasn't here. But she was. In Violet's laughter. In the way Aurora held her sister's hand. In the warmth of a home built from something deeper than biology. Scarlett exhaled. Love was what made a family. And theirs would always be whole.